Most people who grow up around this story hear the same explanation for the spit. It's just Jesus using something humble and ordinary to show that miracles don't need anything fancy. Simple faith, simple means. It's a comforting reading, and it isn't wrong, exactly. But it skips something almost every modern reader misses entirely. That spit, in the 1st century, was not a strange or random choice. It was medicine. Physicians, philosophers, and ordinary people across the Roman world already believed saliva could heal, especially the eyes. Which means Jesus wasn't reaching for something odd to make a point about humility. He was reaching for something his entire audience already recognized as a legitimate cure. And decades later, a Roman emperor would be credited with healing a blind man's eyes the exact same way, as proof that the gods had chosen him to rule. According to the historians who recorded it, the Emperor Vespasian was in Alexandria when a blind man threw himself at his feet, begging him to moisten his eyes with his own saliva, convinced this alone could restore his sight. Vespasian, by these accounts, didn't act immediately. He consulted his physicians first, asking whether such a healing was even medically plausible. They told him it was, since the man wasn't considered entirely beyond hope to begin with. Only then did the emperor agree to try. The historians differ on how much of this they present as genuine medicine and how much as calculated theater designed to elevate a new ruler's legitimacy in the eyes of a skeptical public. But either way, the story only works, only makes sense as propaganda, because everyone hearing it already believed saliva could heal eyes. 2 healers, 1 method, 2 completely different claims about where the power actually came from. So the humble means explanation isn't false, it's just incomplete. The real question is why Jesus would use the most recognizable healing method of his world and still make it unmistakably clear that the recognition was never the point. To understand why, it helps to see the world this healing actually happened in. Not the version we picture from a stained glass window, but the one that existed on the ground. The Roman world Jesus lived in did not draw a hard line between medicine and religion the way we do now. A physician and a priest often occupied the same cultural space, and the boundary between natural remedy and sign from the gods was thin enough that most people didn't bother drawing it. This is the world spitting belonged to, not the back alleys of superstition, the actual medical literature of the era. Roman naturalists wrote entire volumes cataloging what saliva could supposedly cure. Jewish tradition preserved its own sayings about whose spit healed and whose didn't. Egyptian texts, centuries older than either, already described the gods using spit to mend a damaged eye. By the time Jesus walked into Bethsaida, saliva as medicine wasn't a fringe idea. It was closer to common sense, the kind of thing a grandmother might tell you, and a physician might not bother arguing with. Galilee itself sat on the edge of 2 worlds, Jewish in its synagogues, its Sabbath, its expectation of a coming Messiah, Roman in its roads, its taxes, its garrisons, and its exposure to Greco-Roman ideas about the body and healing. A fishing village like Bethsaida wasn't isolated from any of this. Its name simply means house of fishing, and it belonged to a trio of men who would go on to become 3 of the most well-known disciples in the entire gospel story, Peter, Andrew, and Philip. This was, in other words, a place that already had a relationship with Jesus. It had seen him before. And that history makes what happens here carry a little more weight, because elsewhere in the Gospels, Jesus is recorded pronouncing a rare and pointed warning over this exact town, telling it that if the miracles performed within its streets had happened instead in cities with no connection to God's people at all, those cities would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. Bethsaida had watched. Bethsaida, largely, had not changed, so the crowd gathered around this blind man aren't strangers encountering Jesus for the first time. They're neighbors, people who had, in all likelihood, seen him work before and were still, in some sense, standing in the in-between themselves. People there had almost certainly heard of healers who worked with touch, with oil, with a whispered word, and yes, with spit. So when a crowd carries a blind man toward Jesus, and begs him simply to touch the man, not to speak a word over him, not to pray aloud, just to touch him. They are asking for something ordinary by the standards of their world. A healer's touch, maybe a healer's spit. Nothing about the request would have sounded strange to anyone standing there. Blindness itself carried a weight in this world that's easy to underestimate from a distance of 2,000 years. There was no reliable corrective treatment for most causes of vision loss. A person who lost their sight, whether through illness, injury, or a condition present from birth, usually lost their ability to work, to marry into most arrangements, to move through public and religious life the way their neighbors did. Begging was frequently the only economic option left. And beneath all of that sat a widespread assumption, one the disciples voice openly in John's account, that blindness, especially blindness from birth, must trace back to somebody's sin. A child born blind wasn't only living without sight. He was often living under a kind of unspoken verdict about what he, or his parents, must have done to deserve it. That's the weight sitting behind this crowd's simple request. They aren't asking for a party trick. They're asking, on behalf of a man whose entire social and religious standing has likely been shaped by his condition, for the one thing that might restore both his sight and his place in the community at the same time. What they could not have anticipated is what Jesus would do with an ordinary method, and what it would still, somehow, refuse to be ordinary about. The text says simply this: "They came to Bethsaida, and some people brought a blind man and begged him to touch him." That's where the story begins. Not with spectacle, with a request so common it barely needed explaining. The crowd's request is worth pausing on before Jesus does anything at all. They don't ask him to speak a healing word, the method that had already made his reputation across Galilee. They ask him to touch the man. It's a small detail, but it tells us exactly what this crowd expected a healer's hands to be capable of, independent of anything supernatural. Then Mark tells us Jesus does something the crowd didn't request and couldn't have expected. He spits directly onto the man's eyes. Not once, in any other gospel account, does anyone ask Jesus to use spit. He introduces it himself every time it appears. That's a detail easy to miss on a casual read, but it matters. It means the method wasn't crowd-pleasing theater. Nobody was expecting it, let alone demanding it. It wasn't a performance for the audience. It was a specific choice, made by Jesus, for reasons the text doesn't immediately explain. And that's where the real question starts to take shape. Not, is spit a strange thing to use, but why would Jesus reach for something this deliberate when a single word had already proven sufficient for far harder miracles? To answer that, it helps to know exactly how ordinary saliva as medicine actually was. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing decades after Jesus but recording beliefs that predate him, claimed that a fasting person's spit, applied daily, could treat eye disease. He wasn't recording a fringe theory. He was cataloging accepted medical folk knowledge, the kind repeated across an entire empire. Jewish sources preserved something similar. Later rabbinic writings even debate whose saliva carries healing power and whose doesn't, a strange detail, but a telling one. It shows a culture that took the idea seriously enough to argue over its finer points. Some of these Jewish traditions get remarkably specific. One later rabbinic story preserves a debate over a man believed to be a firstborn son, and the reasoning offered to prove it, that his father used to send people to him because his saliva was known to heal, and tradition held that a firstborn spit carried curative power in a way an ordinary person's did not. It's a strange detail to modern ears, but it shows just how far this belief had been worked into the ordinary texture of daily life. This wasn't an obscure theory confined to a handful of physicians. It was common enough to generate folklore, common enough to argue about, common enough that a father would send a stranger to his own son for a cure. So here is the detail worth sitting with. Jesus didn't invent a symbol out of nothing. He picked up a method his entire audience, Jewish, Greek, Roman, already had a category for. It's a little like a doctor today reaching for a stethoscope instead of some invented, unfamiliar instrument. The tool itself isn't the miracle. Thus, it's recognizable, expected even, which raises the stakes on what happens next. Because if the method is ordinary, then whatever makes this healing extraordinary has to come from somewhere else entirely. That somewhere else starts to surface almost immediately, because Mark doesn't let the healing finish on the first attempt. After Jesus spits on the man's eyes and lays hands on him, he asks a question no successful healer should need to ask. "Do you see anything?" The man looks up and answers with one of the strangest lines in the Gospels. "I see people, but they look like trees, walking." If this were simply a demonstration of a known cure, spit as folk medicine, applied by a gifted healer, this is the moment it should have worked cleanly. Ancient medical tradition doesn't describe saliva as a partial cure. It's not staged, it's not gradual. But here, a healing that should complete in one motion doesn't. Something about this miracle is refusing to behave like the medicine it resembles. It's worth comparing this to how Jesus heals almost everywhere else in the Gospels. Bartimaeus, outside Jericho, is healed the instant Jesus speaks, no touch required, let alone spit. A Roman centurion's servant is healed from a distance, without Jesus ever entering the building, because the centurion himself reasons that a word alone should be sufficient, the way a word from him is sufficient for the soldiers under his own command. A synagogue leader's daughter, already dead by the time Jesus arrives, is raised with 2 words and the grip of a hand. A man covered in leprosy is cleansed with a touch and a sentence, no ritual, no waiting. Across all 4 Gospels, the pattern holds so consistently that it barely needs pointing out. A word, spoken from anywhere, is consistently shown to be enough. Which means the 2-stage healing at Bethsaida isn't a limitation of power. Mark has already shown us Jesus doesn't need proximity, ritual, or repetition to heal. So when this particular miracle takes 2 attempts, the text is quietly ruling out the explanation that it was simply harder to perform. Not weakness, choice. And Mark, notably, never tells us why. He doesn't editorialize, he just records the pause, the moment where trees are walking instead of people, and moves forward. It's worth sitting for a moment inside what that pause must have actually felt like for the man living it. He has just been told, in effect, that the healing worked. He can see. After what may have been years, or a lifetime, of total darkness, shapes and color and movement have suddenly returned to him, and yet none of it is right. The world in front of him is smeared and approximate, human figures reduced to something closer to walking timber than to faces he could recognize. It's not blindness anymore, but it isn't sight either. It's a threshold, and the text gives no indication of how long he stood there, in that strange middle distance, before Jesus reached out a second time, long enough, at least, for Mark to consider it worth recording as its own distinct moment, rather than compressing the whole healing into a single verse. That silence is exactly where the placement of this story starts to matter, because this miracle doesn't sit in isolation. Look at what comes directly before it. Just verses earlier, Jesus rebukes his own disciples for a very specific failure. "Do you have eyes and fail to see?" They've watched him feed thousands, twice, and still don't understand who he is. They have functioning eyes. They are, in every sense that matters to Mark, not seeing. Then, immediately after this, a man is healed of physical blindness, in 2 attempts, with an in-between stage where the picture is blurred but not yet clear. And immediately after that, Peter, for the first time in the Gospel, correctly identifies Jesus as the Messiah, though even that confession will prove to be blurred, since minutes later, Peter rebukes Jesus for predicting his own death. 3 scenes. Spiritual blindness. Physical blindness healed in stages. Partial spiritual sight. That's not coincidence. That's structure. Many readers of Mark's Gospel have noticed that this healing sits exactly where it sits, on purpose, sandwiched between 2 moments about the disciples' own slow, uneven vision. It helps to remember what the disciples had actually just witnessed before Jesus asked them whether they had eyes and failed to see. They had watched him take a handful of loaves and feed a crowd of thousands, not once, but twice, with baskets of food left over both times. And still, Crossing the lake afterward, Mark tells us they were worried among themselves because they'd forgotten to bring bread. Jesus' question to them isn't rhetorical frustration, it's diagnostic. They have seen the evidence more than once, and it still hasn't landed. That's the exact condition the blind man's paused, half-formed sight is about to illustrate in physical terms only moments later on the road to the very next town, which reframes the tree's walking line entirely. It's not a strange throwaway detail, it's the exact midpoint of the pattern Mark has just spent several verses establishing. Sight that is real, but not yet full. The man isn't lying, he isn't hallucinating. He's describing exactly what partial sight looks like: shapes, movement, something recognizably human-shaped, but not yet resolved into full clarity. It's the visual language of almost there, which is, not coincidentally, exactly where Mark has just left his disciples. Now, shift to the other account, because Mark isn't the only gospel where Jesus heals blindness this way, and the differences matter as much as the similarities. In John chapter 9, there's no partial healing. Instead, Jesus does something even more deliberate. He spits on the ground, mixes the saliva with dirt to make mud, and applies it directly to the eyes of a man who has been blind since birth. Mud carries weight that plain saliva doesn't. In both Hebrew and Greek tradition, the language of dust and clay is the same language used to describe how the first human being was formed, dust from the ground, shaped by hand. Many commentators, going back to the earliest centuries of the Church, read this healing as a quiet echo of Genesis. Not simply a repair job, but something closer to a small act of new creation. That reading isn't stated outright in the text. John doesn't stop to explain it, the way he explains the word Siloam. But the imagery sits close enough to the creation account that generations of readers, working in very different traditions and centuries apart from one another, have noticed it independently. And John does give us one detail he spells out directly. The name of the pool Jesus sends the man to wash in. Go, wash in the Pool of Siloam, which means sent. That pool had a history of its own long before this healing. Centuries earlier, the prophet Isaiah referred to these same waters when he confronted King Ahaz of Judah, a ruler facing a genuine military threat and tempted to secure his kingdom through a political alliance rather than through trust in God. Isaiah's message to him centered on quietly flowing water, a gentle, unthreatening stream, offered as a picture of what it looks like to rely on God, rather than on more forceful, self-directed solutions. Whether John intends for his readers to hear that older story echoing behind this one is difficult to state with certainty. But the location itself was never neutral ground. It carried, long before Jesus sent a blind man there, an established association with trust versus self-reliance. John doesn't leave that translation for the viewer to dig up. He hands it over. Which means the last step of this healing isn't really about the water at all. It's about the word. A blind man, made of mud like the first human being, is told to go wash in a pool named Sent by the very person who, throughout John's Gospel, repeatedly identifies himself as the one sent by the Father. The healing isn't complete until the man obeys an instruction that, on its surface, has nothing to do with sight. He has to walk there mostly blind, trusting a stranger's word. Here's where the two accounts, different as their methods are, land on the exact same idea. In Mark, healing arrives in two deliberate stages, using a method familiar to anyone in that world. In John, healing arrives through mud that echoes the language of humanity's first formation, completed only once the man acts in obedience to a word he can't yet verify with his own eyes. Neither miracle needed to happen this way. Jesus had already shown, repeatedly, that a single word from any distance was sufficient. It's worth placing both of these accounts side by side against Bartimaeus one more time, because the contrast sharpens something easy to miss on a single pass through the text. Bartimaeus sits by the roadside outside Jericho, hears that Jesus is passing, and starts shouting before anyone gives him permission to. The crowd tells him to be quiet. He shouts louder. When Jesus finally calls him over, Bartimaeus throws off his cloak. the one possession a blind beggar in that world would have depended on most, and comes running. Jesus asks him what he wants, he answers immediately, and his sight returns on the spot, with no touch, no spit, no mud, nothing but a single sentence. Compare that to the man at Bethsaida, brought by other people, never once quoted asking for anything himself, healed in 2 uncertain stages. Or the man born blind in John, who doesn't seek Jesus out either, and who has to walk away still unhealed, mud drying on his face, before his sight arrives at all. Mark and John seem to have preserved 3 healings of blindness that look almost nothing alike in their mechanics, and the differences aren't incidental. They read like 3 separate case studies in how differently faith and healing can actually unfold, even under the hand of the same healer, which means the method, familiar, physical, deliberately unhurried in 2 of the 3, isn't filling a gap in his power. It's making a different kind of claim altogether. The same tools the ancient world already trusted to heal the body are being used by someone claiming to do something the ancient world had no category for at all. If you're starting to notice how much is actually happening underneath a detail most people skim past in 2 seconds, that's exactly the kind of noticing this channel exists for. If this is opening the text up for you in a new way, subscribing helps more of these documentaries reach you as they come out, because there's still a piece of this story we haven't touched. In John's account, the healing doesn't end when the man's sight returns. It's just getting started. John tells us this healing happened on the Sabbath. That single detail changes the entire second half of the chapter, because in the eyes of the religious authorities watching, Jesus hadn't simply healed a man, he had worked. Mixing dirt and saliva into mud, in the framework many first-century religious leaders operated within, could be understood as a form of kneading, a category of labor associated with the kind of work the Sabbath was meant to forbid. Whether that specific legal category was already formally codified in Jesus' day, the way it would be centuries later in rabbinic writing, is difficult to say with full certainty. But the underlying principle, that this looked like work performed on a day work wasn't permitted, is exactly what the text shows the religious leaders reacting to. So what began as a private act of compassion becomes a public controversy. Neighbors, seeing a beggar they've known for years suddenly walking around with working eyes, aren't even sure it's the same man. Some insist it is, others aren't convinced. There's something almost comic, in a very human way, about a man having to keep repeating the same simple line to people who have looked at his face for years. I am the man. It's a small detail, but it says something true about how reluctant people can be to accept a change they weren't expecting, even when the evidence is standing right in front of them. Eventually he's brought before the Pharisees, and the questioning begins. Some of them conclude Jesus cannot be from God because he broke the Sabbath. Others push back, asking how a sinner could perform a sign like this at all. It's a genuine split among people who otherwise share the same convictions, the same scriptures, the same religious training, and it's worth pausing on how uncomfortable that must have been. A sign this significant should have settled the argument. Instead, it exposes how differently 2 people can read the same evidence when they start from different assumptions about what God is and isn't willing to do on a particular day of the week. The healed man, asked for his own opinion, gives an answer with a kind of plain-spoken courage that's easy to overlook. He says, I don't know if he is a sinner. One thing I do know. I was blind, and now I see. It's a remarkable line, not because it's theologically sophisticated, but because it isn't trying to be. He doesn't claim to understand Jesus' identity, his authority, or the finer points of Sabbath law. He testifies only to what happened to him, and he refuses to be talked out of it. The authorities press further, and when that doesn't work, they summon his parents, hoping to undercut his story at its source. But his parents, afraid of a specific and very real threat being formally put out of the synagogue for acknowledging Jesus, decline to answer for him. He's a grown man, they say. Ask him yourself. So the man is questioned a second time, and this time his answers grow sharper, almost mocking. Why do you want to hear it again? He asks them. Do you also want to become his disciples? The question lands as an insult, and the authorities respond by hurling one back. They tell him he was steeped in sin at birth, an accusation that reaches all the way back to the disciples' original question at the start of the chapter, and they throw him out. There's a quiet detail worth noticing in that exchange. The man never once asked to be healed. He didn't seek Jesus out, the way Bartimaeus would later cry out from the roadside, or the way the woman with the bleeding disorder would push through a crowd just to touch the edge of his robe. Jesus approached him, unasked, on an ordinary day, and afterward, this same man is the one left defending that healing alone, without Jesus present, without his disciples present, in a room designed to make him doubt what he had already experienced with his own restored eyes. It's a strange kind of loneliness, being certain of something true and having no one in the room willing to believe you. Jesus finds him afterward, outside the religious system that has just rejected him, and asks if he believes in the Son of Man. The man asks who that is, so that he might believe. And Jesus tells him plainly, "You have seen him. It is the one speaking with you." Then Jesus says something that reaches back to draw the entire chapter together. "For judgment I came into this world, so that the blind will see, and those who see will become blind." Some of the Pharisees standing nearby ask if he means them. Jesus' answer is the sharpest line in the whole account. If you were blind, you would not be guilty of sin. But now that you claim you can see, your guilt remains. Notice what has happened by the end of this chapter. The man with no working eyes at the start now sees clearly, both physically and, in John's telling, spiritually, since he ends the story worshiping Jesus outright. And the religious leaders, who never doubted their own sight for a moment, are the ones the chapter leaves standing in the dark. Every category has flipped. The one everyone assumed was cursed by God turns out to be the one who recognizes him. The ones certain of their own clarity turn out to be the ones who can't see what's standing directly in front of them. That reversal isn't a side detail. It's the entire architecture of John chapter 9. A healing that starts with mud on a beggar's face ends with a verdict on the religious establishment's own blindness. And it happens, worth remembering, because Jesus used the most unremarkable materials imaginable. Spit, dirt, water from a pool most residents of Jerusalem walked past without a second thought. There's one more layer to that mud worth slowing down for, because on the surface it looks like nothing more than an ancient remedy applied by hand. Go back to Genesis. When the text describes the forming of the first human being, it doesn't say God spoke him into existence the way he spoke light, or land, or stars into being. Genesis says God formed him from the dust of the ground, shaped by hand, the way a potter works clay. It's the one act of creation in that chapter that is physical. Hands-on, deliberate. Now hold that image next to John chapter 9. Jesus doesn't heal this man with a word, even though John's gospel opens by declaring that the entire world was spoken into being through him. He kneels down, he mixes his own spit with dirt, he shapes it. He presses it, by hand, onto a place on this man's body that has never worked correctly, not since the day he was born. That detail matters more than it first appears. This isn't a man who lost his sight and is having it restored. He was born this way. There was never a version of him that could see, which means what happens in John 9 isn't repair. Its origin, something that was never finished, is, for the first time, being completed, and it's completed with the same substance Genesis uses to describe how the first human being came to exist at all. This is where the connection has to be handled carefully. John never stops to say, "This is Genesis, remember Genesis." He doesn't cite it, he doesn't quote it. This isn't a stated fulfillment the way a prophecy might explicitly point back to its source. It's an echo, a deliberate one, most interpreters believe, given how carefully John's gospel opens with its own creation language. In the beginning was the Word. But it remains an inference drawn from pattern, not a claim the text makes outright, and it deserves to be held with that honesty. Still, once you see it, it's difficult to unsee. A man who has never had working eyes is formed, in part, the same way the very first human being was formed. Not spoken into sight, shaped into it. There's a detail in Job that strengthens this reading without overstating it. Long before the Gospels, Job describes his own body to God in a moment of raw honesty, saying, "Remember that you fashioned me like clay. Will you turn me to dust again?" The Hebrew word behind clay there sits in close relationship with the same word used for dust in Genesis, the two images functioning almost interchangeably across the Old Testament whenever a human being reflects on their own origin and fragility. So the imagery Jesus works with in John 9 isn't an isolated poetic flourish invented for this one scene. It belongs to a much older biblical vocabulary, one that consistently reaches for clay and dust whenever Scripture wants to remind its readers what a human being fundamentally is, and whose hands originally shaped them. And this is where the Vespasian parallel stops being a curiosity and becomes something sharper. Vespasian's spit, according to the story told about him decades later, restored something that already existed, sight a man had lost. It borrowed the form of a miracle without any claim to have made anything. It was restoration pretending to be power. What happens in John 9 was never framed as restoration at all. It reads, to careful readers across many centuries, like a quiet continuation of creation itself. That's the shape this entire investigation has been pointing toward. The method was never the miracle. Spit, mud, a formed handful of dust pressed onto unfinished eyes, all of it recognizable, all of it borrowed from the ordinary vocabulary of the ancient world. What was never ordinary and never reproducible was the hand doing the shaping. 2 men, 2 mornings. 2 handfuls of the same ordinary substance, one outside a fishing village, led by strangers, spit pressed onto eyes that have seen before and stopped seeing, trees walking. Then a second touch, and everything resolves into focus. One in Jerusalem, on a Sabbath, eyes that have never worked at all, dust, saliva. Hands shaping mud the way hands once shaped the first man from the ground. Then a walk, mostly blind, toward a pool named for the very idea of being sent. Then a trial, then a verdict, not on him, but on the ones who thought they could already see. Around them both, a world that already believed in what Jesus was doing. Physicians who trusted saliva. Rabbis who argued about whose spit could heal and whose couldn't. An empire that, within the same century, would prop up a Caesar's authority using this exact image. Familiar tools, familiar methods, a world fluent in exactly what it was watching. And still, not one word of it explains what actually happened. Not the pause between trees and clearly, not the deliberate shaping of a man never able to see, formed the way the first human being was formed. Not a healer who could speak from any distance, choosing instead to kneel down and use his hands. Not a beggar with no religious standing at all, outlasting a room full of experts in the very scriptures they claim to understand. The method borrowed everything the ancient world already believed. The power behind it borrowed nothing from anyone. Most of us know what it feels like to see people as trees walking. Not literally. But there's a version of this everyone eventually lives through, a season where something is undeniably happening, some kind of clarity is arriving, and it still isn't finished. Faith that's real but blurry, understanding that's begun but not complete, answers that are shaped but not yet resolved. It's an uncomfortable place to stand. The temptation in that middle stage is to assume something has gone wrong, that if this were really God's doing, it would have arrived whole, the first time, no waiting required. But the man at Bethsaida didn't do anything to earn a second touch. He didn't fail some invisible test between the first hand and the second. He simply waited in the space between blurred and clear, because the one healing him wasn't finished yet. And the man born blind didn't get to see the outcome before he obeyed. He had to walk, mud still on his face, sight not yet restored, toward a pool he couldn't verify would do anything at all. The healing depended on movement he couldn't confirm was worth making, in a direction he was told to trust before he had any proof it mattered. And even after his sight came back, the hardest part of his story was still ahead of him, defending what he knew to be true in front of people determined not to believe him. That's a strange kind of grace to sit with. Not sight first, then obedience. Obedience first, in the dark, then sight. Not certainty first, then courage. A single, plain testimony, held on to under pressure, long before anyone had the words to explain what it meant. There's something worth noticing, too, in how little the healed man in John 9 actually claims to know. He doesn't defend a doctrine. He doesn't win the theological argument the Pharisees keep trying to draw him into. He repeats, almost stubbornly, the one thing he's actually experienced. I was blind. Now I see. That's not evasion. It's often the most honest form of testimony available to someone standing in the middle of their own unfinished story, unable yet to explain the whole of what's happened to them, but unwilling to deny the part they've already lived. Most people don't get to skip that part. Most people don't get healing that arrives finished, or faith that arrives whole, or clarity that arrives all at once. Most people live somewhere between the first touch and the second, trusting a voice they can't fully see yet, walking toward water they haven't reached, holding on to the one thing they do know for certain, even when they can't yet defend all the rest. Maybe that's what makes both of these stories worth returning to, not because they resolve quickly, but because they don't. One man stands blinking at trees that look like people, waiting for a second touch he has no power to hurry along. The other walks through a city with mud still drying on his face, sight not yet restored, obeying an instruction he has no way yet to confirm was worth following. Neither of them is given the comfort of already knowing how the story ends. And yet Mark and John both preserve these moments carefully, almost tenderly, as though the waiting itself deserved to be written down, not skipped past on the way to the ending everyone already wants to reach. The story never says that in-between place is a failure. It says, quietly, that it's where hands are still working. He didn't need the mud. He chose it, because some kinds of power are proven, not by what they can skip, but by what they're willing to touch. If this is the kind of scripture study that helps you slow down and actually see the text again, consider subscribing to the Scripture Project. That's what this channel exists to do, and if this opened something up for you, send it to someone who might need to sit in that in-between place a little longer today. Thank you for spending this time in the text with me.